Zach, we are back, and it is a special occasion because we are back with our final moves to make video of the offseason. It's a special moment. There's some heartbreak here. We're saying goodbye to the offseason. We're saying hello to the NFL regular season. You'll be watching real, high paced regular season football this week. And also, as a special, we have some moves to not make as well because hey, some of the moves you're not making are just as important, if not more important, than the moves you're trying to make. So some things to avoid as well. But first and foremost, first move to make, like the video, comment down below what moves you're trying to make before that season ticks on over, and maybe some moves not to make before the season ticks on over. We want to hear from you over in our Patreon Discord as well, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in there for a free 7-day trial. Check us out and get in on the madness of week one, because I tell you what, it is going to be hype in that NFL game day chat. But with all that said, Zach, all the promo in the books, let's get to our first move to make. You're kicking it off here. What do you got? Tell me about it. Tell me why.
Yeah, Bob, first of all, congratulations. Season be with you. We made it. 35 weeks. We did it.
Season be with
That's funny. My first move to make, Bob, is I am trying to get off of age, if I'm able to, in tier down situations and maintain competitiveness. That's a mouthful right there. So let's kind of break it down a little bit. There are some players, Bob, I absolutely love and have no problem keeping until their fantasy value just expires on my roster. I got no problem with that. You know, a good example would be like a Mike Evans. I would have no problem, and I'm going to use Mike Evans because somebody that I did trade recently. If I'm able to, I'd like to be able to tier down maybe a little bit in value, but also a little bit in age, because at the end of the day, when players their values do expire on a roster, that is a hit to our teams one way or the other. Whether you're competitive, whether you're rebuilding, it's not a good feeling, and it's especially good when you don't see it coming. But you know, we are talking about more elite players that are playing into their 30s. I mean, like there's probably a lot of people that wish they had moved off Todd Gurley when he was running back one for like 3 straight seasons, and then he had one, I think, running back 14 season, and then just disappeared off the face of the planet. So, you know, it's hard to predict that because that's, you know, a player is 26, 27 years old. But I'm really talking about older players here. Good examples would be, like I said, Mike Evans, Devontae Adams would be another one. You can talk about a lot of older quarterbacks. Kirk Cousins would be on this list, so on and so forth. Travis Kelce could be on this list. So really what I'm trying to do is take these players and tier down in age and also value. So I got 2 examples on here. I know I only have one on the show sheet, but I thought of another one as we were jumping on into the show. I recently sold off in a league I'm very, very much competing in. I sold off Mike Evans and Jahan Dotson. I didn't include Jahan Dotson in the trade, just for, you know, everybody asking out there. Wow. It wasn't me. It wasn't me who forced Jahan Dotson. I was asked for Jahan Dotson. By the way, to our boy Obi, shout out. And I traded those 2 guys for Deontay Johnson, Jordan Whittington, and a 2027 third-round pick. I know the third-round pick is like so far out there, but I knew better than to ask for a 25 or a 26. I'm like, you can't say no to a pick 3 years from now. So I was able to get that third-round pick. Look, I'm banking on, obviously, Deontay Johnson kind of fulfilling the prophecy of the wide receiver that he's been talked about a lot in this offseason and even the past few seasons. But like, would it be mind-blowing if I said Mike Evans is not a wide receiver 1 this season and he's wide receiver 15 or 18?
No.
Okay,
no.
so like
I think go ahead.
No, that's just the safe prediction. I'm not expecting Mike Evans to be wide receiver 7 again, because that's just not a realistic. I'll say this every video. I'm about managing my expectations. If I get a wide receiver 7 seasons out of Mike Evans, great. But I'm not expecting that. When I put him into my lineup, I'm expecting something more realistic. And if I get extra, great. That's awesome. It's only going to help my team. But you minimize, you know, risk and situations that don't come to fruition where you're disappointed by saying, hey, I don't think Mike Evans is going to be a wide receiver 1. So I was able to do that, move off the age, obviously a 31-year-old player, I think, for a 28-year-old player. So a little bit less wear on the tread from Mike Evans to Deontay Johnson. And then look, the rest of the trade is the rest of Jordan Whittington and a third for Jahan Dotson. I think you'd love that trade, right? You're totally off the Jahan Dotson bandwagon. So
yeah.
And then another one I did recently, this was in a non-tight end premium league. I moved Travis Kelce for a T. Higgins. I'm not a T. Higgins person, but I was just like, I got to get off Travis Kelce because who knows? It could be 2 years. It could be 1 year. It could be 2 weeks. We have no idea. I had some middling tight ends on that roster. I don't really have a backup plan, but it's not a roster I'm expecting to be competitive. Or I just took it over. So yeah, I was able to pivot off that age of Travis Kelce and get a much younger player in T. Higgins.
Yeah.
And this was one too, Bob, where I even had a conversation with the owner, and I was like, "Listen, I'll take this deal, but like, you like, are you aware? Like, it's one of those deals where you like, should I accept this? Is the league going to be okay?" I didn't ask for it. I had nothing to do with that offer except hitting the accept button. So, but again, 2 situations where I've been able to pivot off age to comparable talents. Maybe I'm not getting that production this year. Who knows? Maybe in the T. Higgins case, I probably am, because wide receiver points and tight end points in a non-tight end premium league, wide receiver points are more valuable. So, again, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to protect myself in certain situations, but I'm also okay with just hanging on to Mike Evans or hanging on to a Devontae Adams or hanging on to a Travis Kelce, because for the last 3-4 years, we've been saying, hey, it's time to move off this player, and it hasn't been time to move off this player, and it's been worth it. Another good example, Alvin Kamara, probably going to have a pretty decent season this year. Can I do this and maintain my competitiveness is really what I'm trying to do here, because, look, this is a point I'm going to start hitting in a lot of my videos, Bob, is this is my 3rd year with the channel. It's time to start winning. It's time to start winning games, winning championships, having bragging rights amongst your league and saying, so I'm not going to be talking continuously about rebuilding moves, and I'm going to try and talk about how to maintain being competitive and stay competitive, because we've been talking about how to be competitive for 3 to 5 years. And it's time to do that. It's time to put our money where our mouth is, win some games, win some money, and win some fantasy championships, Bob. So again, going to try and tear down, get some youth, or maybe just a little bit of a younger player, maybe not necessarily youth. Like 28 years old is not youth. You're just getting younger from 31, but also hopefully still maintain the same amount of points in my starting lineup.
Yeah, this one, I think the only pushback you'll get from this on me overall, I don't hate the deal, but I do think the real value you're getting out of this is the youngerness of Deontay Johnson. Being that 3 years younger, you get to have him on your roster for that much longer. Hopefully we see a bit of a resurgence to Deontay's peak that he was. Not saying he's going to be wide receiver 1, but hopefully he can get into that even fringe wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. I'd feel pretty good about getting him at this value. If that's where he is, because Mike Evans, I think you lose a bit of upside, but like you noted, you get out from the risk of Mike Evans trailing off. And, with these guys that produce into their 30s still, we know that cliff comes quick and it comes hard. So you get off of that. Yes, you might lose a little pop. That's my main concern. But if you're not expecting, you said it was a very competitive roster. If Mike Evans wasn't necessarily your wide receiver 1 or 2 production wise, I don't hate this deal at all. I think Deontay, where he is, what you're getting him for, this deal is pivot. I think Jordan Whittington could very well possibly be more productive for you this year than Jahan Dotson. And anytime you get a little third sprinkled in on top, I'm more than happy to see that as well. But we're also talking about a competitive team here, Zach. Oddly enough, this is a team I've been rebuilding for the last couple of years. I went full scorched earth rebuild. I think it was after the 2022 season with this roster I happen to be talking about now. But, I've turned the corner. I've made my splash ad. I went and bought Jamar Chase at one point in one of the rookie drafts. I did this, that, and the other thing. I bought Chris Olave, drafted some fun players, whatever the case is. I feel like this team is ready, this team I'm talking about. However, I am very rough at running back. That is the one position I've never addressed. And hey, that's how I approach my rebuilds generally. My running back 1 and 2 at the moment is Trey Benson and Marshawn Lloyd. Not great running backs to be going into a competitive push with. Granted, the worst case scenario is because I don't have any age on my roster. I'm all, 2, 3, 4-year vets at most, just about across every position. So nobody's aging out. So if I don't get my running back of the future of my competitive running backs, not a big deal. But I have a bevy of draft capital. So I'm chasing some cheapo, baller on a budget type veteran running backs. We've been talking about them all offseason. And I know we're hammering this point home, but this has been my all I've been doing in this league this last week is trying to buy these, cheaper running backs, these, more accessible running back options, because they're old. They're on the trade block for a lot of these guys too. So it's not like I'm cold calling or anything like that. I'm, reaching out to players that, hey, these guys are on the block, so I should have some sort of accessing them. But my issue that I'm running into with, and this is going to be an issue for you too, why sometimes you can't buy these guys as cheap as they are. They're on somewhat competitive teams already. I'll talk about one of the points later. One of our in our moves to not make section. I don't think the team's competitive, but they think they're competitive. So it's always that one of those conversations we have to have as managers. But some veterans I like at their current value that I'm chasing very aggressively. Guys like James Conner, Alvin Kamara, you mentioned him previously, Raheem Mostert, Tony Pollard are just a few names. I'm not expecting running back one production out of any of them. However, if James Conner was a running back one this year at minimum at points per game, wouldn't be the least bit surprised. I also really like that ad because, as I mentioned, I have Trey Benson. So even if James Conner misses time, I'm probably covered up at that position, and I should have what we expect to be the long-term solution there as well. So that's why I like buying that as, my bridge option, and then having Trey Benson on the backside. Alvin Kamara is just a guy we love. It's a PPR league as well, and he's just going to eat in that league. Raheem Mostert, somebody who we've talked about being as extremely undervalued. A lot of people are just kind of expecting the wheels to fall off. Devon A. Chan is going to take all of the carries, and I think he's going to be productive. Don't get me wrong, but I think Raheem Mostert still has a very important role in this offense. Tony Pollard, I just flat out think Tyjae Spears is not the guy everybody wants him to be. I think he's more Jalen Warren than James Cook. I know people have, or I've mentioned that previously, not people, but I've mentioned that previously as well. I think if you're expecting a James Cook type year, you're going to be sorely disappointed when he turns in Jalen Warren type numbers. Excuse me. So Tony Pollard is another name I like, and none of these guys should cost you more than a second round pick, or a player of similar value. Maybe you can find a wide receiver that also helps that competitive team be competitive, and they kind of get to do what you're doing, with your Mike Evans to Deontay Johnson. Maybe I move Deontay Johnson for one of those backs, and they still get to have a more competitive asset, whatever the case is, and everybody's still fine and happy, as opposed to trying to trade them draft capital, which unfortunately I have plenty of. So now what I'm going to go and do, back to the drawing board, is try to, take the longest way to this as I can, move some of my extra seconds to maybe teams that have rookies, or that are, younger focused, looking to the future, want rookie picks, see if I can buy from them any aging vets they have kicking around, and maybe swap some of these guys out down the road. So I have to kind of work hard to get this done, but I'm going to do my absolute best. As I mentioned, if they're on competitive teams, it's going to be that much harder. Know your league mates, know where their heads are at, because it might allow you to kind of see what gateways are actually there, as opposed to, well, this guy's on the block, I should definitely be able to go trade for him. Sometimes you might just not have the right pieces to what that team is looking for. Having discussions, getting in that inbox, knocking on some doors is a great way to do that. So seconds for most of these guys, or a second round pick for most of these guys, I should say, maybe a pair of thirds for Raheem Mostert. I'd be surprised if you had to pay that much, considering we've seen multiple deals since we brought up the Cortland Sutton trade for Raheem Mostert, of people trading Cortland Sutton for Raheem Mostert. So if you have Cortland Sutton kicking around, you want some running back help, that's an option for you as well. Some other guys you've talked about, that are a little less, veteran buys, maybe you want to stick to younger backs. Two that are kind of younger that have a good bit of, I don't want to say upside, but security and upside-ish because of their youth. James Cook, Isaiah Pacheco, two guys I kind of like on that fringe running back one value, but are also pretty in line with what I think their production is going to be on the fringe of running back one as well. So those are some names. A little more expensive, probably cost you in the range of a first, maybe a Jaden Reed, as we just keep throwing that poor guy's name out there as much as we like him. But Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Any other veteran running backs you'd like to go get? Derrick Henry is one I forgot to mention. I'd be interested in going to get as well. And he might be even cheaper depending on who the team you're talking to. I know in my situation, these guys are already on a lot of competitive teams, or teams that think they're competitive. But the fact of the matter is that might not be the case in your league. So it's just as important. Keep knocking on doors. You never know if some of these guys are going to want to, they've been waiting for that offer to come in, to give them the option to turn things over, look to next year, look to the future, but they feel committed because they have these running backs kicking around. maybe you can kind of go make that decision for them a little bit by giving them the option. I put on here, and I definitely want to get this note in there. Some of these guys could be kicking around on rosters who are playing the hokey pokey where they're half in and half out. And that's how you get in the middle too. So help make that decision, get those players off the roster, send that offer, knock on some doors. Zach, your thoughts on this one?
First of all, I'm very disappointed. You left out a name. I don't think you brought this name. Devin Singletary.
Sure, I like it. Yeah, I just
Devin
kind of forgot
Singletary.
about it, spaced it.
Well, like I think of the names on this list, maybe other than Raheem Mostert, and I think you'll have trouble unless Raheem Mostert is on a team that's not competitive, which is odd at this point of the season. I think that's the cheapest one for the value that you can get, like cheapest to because again, you might be able to get Raheem Mostert for 2/3, but the likelihood is Raheem Mostert is on a team that's trying to win it all. Unless it's a league in its first year and things are still kind of muddled. If this league's in its third or fourth year, those kinds of things are sorted out by this point. Devin Singletary, man, I mean, I think a lot of people are sleeping on him. Clearly the RB1 in New York. Whatever the situation at the offensive line is, I don't know. But they invested in him, and behind him is Eric Gray and Tyrone Tracy. So it's pretty much the Devin Singletary show, and I just don't think the cost is all that much. Maybe a late second. Maybe you can pull off, I don't know, Jacoby Myers for Devin Singletary, something like that. Yeah. And then here's two other names I don't think you mentioned. Kind of the injury fill-in running backs, Jerome Ford and Chuba Hubbard.
Sure, I like those.
Yeah, two running backs that I think the first 4 weeks will have a lot of relevancy, and then after that point, you'll have teams start separating themselves, and then you go and start looking at the $5 bin of the dumpster fire teams in your league and see what you can get. But I mean, Chuba Hubbard right now has the direct line for the first 4 weeks of production, and even last year in that offense, he was productive. In a terrible offense, he was productive. So I expect it to be, if not the same, a little bit better. And then Jerome Ford, not somebody I'm all that in love with, but he's going to be there. And I think no matter what happens with Nick Chubb, Jerome Ford will be a part of that offense. Maybe a 50-50 share, maybe 60-40 Chubb Ford. Yeah. I don't know, but I just don't think Jerome Ford just goes away when Nick Chubb comes back. So two guys that you could look at there. And then, like I said, you could even try and flip them in the season to their respective Nick Chubb or Jonathan Brooks owners, so on and so forth. So two names there that I thought could potentially fit this point. Just help you get through the first month of the season, pretty much.
I love that add-on point. Such a good point, especially in my case where I just have no running back help. So go get me some guys that can hopefully last, and let some of these guys that I don't think are true competitors go 0-4 to start the season and be like, whoa, I need to do something. And then I buy the running backs I need then for the long haul. It's an awesome add-on point, Zach. So get into your next move to make here.
Well, this point really depends on my team outlook, Bob, and you're going to talk about being in the middle later on in the show, and we're big advocates of not doing that. So if my, this point depends on the perspective of, am I a rebuilding team or am I a competing team? But depending on my situation, Bob, I am either trying to ensure that if I am competing, I have 3 startable quarterbacks to begin the season, or if I am competitive, that at some point soon enough, I am moving these starting quarterbacks off my roster, not just to get points off the roster, but to capitalize on that value that you were able to get for these quarterbacks in the first few weeks of the season. Good examples of these, and I'll talk about kind of the 2 tiers that I have, but just real quick thoughts. Jacoby Brissett named the starter in New England. Who knows when it's going to be Drake May's time? It would be so good for Drake May to not play all this year because that offensive line is so bad. And I just think that putting him into a situation where he could get hurt or he could lose his confidence like a Justin Fields. So, I think Drake may be a perfect situation that he doesn't play, but you don't know. The Patriots could say after their bye, okay, it's Drake May time. So I'd want to get Jacoby Brissett off my roster if I'm a non-competing team. If I am a competing team, I want to have a safer QB3, one that at least just gives me a stopgap quarterback for this season. So I came up with 2 tiers of these quarterbacks. But really what I'm trying to do here, Bob, is if I am competing, I don't want to be in a situation where I'm having to start a running back, wide receiver, or a tight end in the super flex spot. That is such a disadvantage to any team starting a second quarterback. You have almost guaranteed yourself a lost position in your matchup that week. It's very rare that a running back, wide receiver, tight end will outscore a quarterback. I don't say very rare, but I would say like 80-20, that a quarterback that starts in the super flex spot will outscore any other position starting in that spot. So I don't want to be in that spot. So I came up with 2 tiers here. I came up with lower level safe options. Will Levis. I just don't see at any point them turning the reins over to Mason Rudolph. I don't. Baker Mayfield just signed a 3-year deal. And Geno Smith. While I don't love Geno Smith's long-term outlook, he's safe for this year. Those are 3 options that I feel a little bit safer acquiring because I feel secure for 1 year. The riskier options that can get replaced, we did talk about Jacoby Brissett, and then, of course, Sam Darnold and Gardner Minshew. Those 2 guys just have absolutely no job security. They've been named the quarterback ones, but, at any point they could turn to Nick Mullins. At any point they could turn to Aiden O'Connell. You never know. Obviously, if I had Sam Darnold, I'd be trying to acquire Nick Mullins on my roster. Same with Gardner Minshew. I'd be trying to have Aiden O'Connell. Not that I love having Aiden O'Connell as a quarterback, but, can you get me 12 points? So, yeah, Bob, if I'm a contender, I really want to have a secure quarterback 3. Like I said at the beginning, to start the season, you don't know how things are going to go. We saw last year so many quarterbacks. I think the stat was 102 missed games at the quarterback position, a 16% increase from 2022 to 2023. So there are going to be these situations where you got to capitalize on the Jake Brownings, the Joe Flaccos, the Nick Mullins, the Josh Dobbs, so on and so forth. But I want to roll into my season as a contender with 3 quarterbacks just to be safe and secure at any of those. And if I'm not a contender and I'm a rebuilder or a team that's planning to really go in 2025, I want to move those fringe quarterbacks. Even a Will Levis, a Baker Mayfield, or a Geno Smith, I want to move those quarterbacks this season, A, to get the points off the roster, but B, those guys are not guaranteed a job in 2025. So I kind of just want to, and even though Baker Mayfield just signed that contract, 1 bad year is all it takes for them to say, I don't think this is working for us. And they'll eat a year of dead money and move on. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying I want to minimize myself to that risk of exposure. So again, I'm competing. I want the restartable quarterbacks. I'm rebuilding. I want to move those fringe quarterbacks, those lower level, safer options that I talked about, and even those riskier options that can get replaced at any point, get them off my roster and make sure I capitalize on their value while they're starting quarterbacks.
I just have like one follow-up-ish question, and it's just how you feel about, if you're competing, obviously, guys like Derek Carr, Matthew Stafford, Aaron Rodgers, who are obviously locked in this year, as long as they're healthy, going to play out their seasons. If you have some of these guys, how hard do you think it is to get from any of them to those quarterbacks? And are you interested in any of those quarterbacks making pivots off of these, especially the Darnold, the Minshew, the Jacoby Brissetts that could get the plug pulled at any moment, possibly? How do you feel about those pivots as well?
I, as a matter of fact, have quite a few shares of Derek Carr at this point as my quarterback 3, including our Rewinders League. I did acquire him this offseason because that report came out that he's the quarterback for the next 2 years. And I was like, all right, cool. Like, I'll buy a quarterback for 2 years at that point. I'm not pivoting off of an Aaron Rodgers, Derek Carr. Who was the other quarterback that you said?
Pivoting to Matthew Stafford or Aaron Rodgers.
Oh yeah, if I would call that a tier up because talent wise, those guys are better.
Yeah, pivot.
Security, they're like, I don't know how long Aaron Rodgers is there, but that's a 1 year. Aaron Rodgers at this point is a 1 year thing. Like you can never look at Aaron Rodgers as a 2 year thing. However, if he's healthy, he's a quarterback 2 easily. Will Levis, you have no idea. Baker Mayfield could be quarterback 1, could be quarterback 30. No idea. Geno Smith, same thing. I mean, they could run the ball 50 times. You have no idea how that's going to go. So if I could pivot to a Derek Carr, to an Aaron Rodgers, to a Matthew Stafford, I would absolutely love to do that. And like I said, I have quite a bit of Derek Carr shares at this point and Spencer Rattler to make sure I have that security in my quarterback 3 position.
Sick. I love it. Love the point. I, too, want to find a quarterback 3 if I don't have one. I don't have one in our Rewinders League and in our Going for Gold League as well. I'm playing it risky. I decided to invest in other positions that could start every week as opposed to only starting 2 quarterbacks. So it's a bold strategy, Cotton. We'll see if it works out for him. But moving along here, this one is probably a pretty boring move to make, but I think it's one that, with the season upon us, we want to be able to set lineups, and roster management is a pretty important thing in the season. People don't, it's very easy over the course of the offseason to let that thing. It's like managing your house. If you have weeds in your yard, you let them run wild for too long, and then it's just a mess, and you never want to deal with it again. And then you have a weed garden, not that kind of weed garden. But checking roster limits, Zach, is super important. Making cuts, tradeaways, tier downs, taxi maneuvers, etc., as needed, super important. The season is upon us. It's time to get the thing in line if you have not already. I know I've looked at some of my rosters. I have to make cuts. I have some extra space kicking around, but let's talk about it. If you're rostering too many players, cut anyone who isn't on an NFL team. You don't need to roster them anymore. They're done, probably washed. Anyone who isn't on an NFL team at this point on a 53 on an NFL roster, don't worry about it. Cut anyone who was cut last week, even if they were picked up by a new team. I probably don't care. I talked about it in last week's moves to make. Nobody in the top 50 except for at each position, except for Tanner Hudson, Bailey Zappi, and Tommy DeVito were the only top 50 players at each of their respective positions. No running backs or wide receivers, were at the top 50 of their positions after being cut in August. Things to think about. So, and then anything else, maybe you have some excess depth kicking around, trade some pieces for late rookie draft capital. I'm talking deeper stash type players, not players that you could reliably start on a weekly basis. You could trade some of them too. Maybe make some tier up deals, tier up trades to make your starting roster that much better. Obviously, some awesome things you could do there, but trade some of the excess depth, those stashes that you don't really need, for some late round rookie draft capital or fab, whatever that manager would use to go get them off the waiver wire if they want them. Here you go. Another thing, maybe you have some extra roster spots kicking around. Comb waivers for any worthwhile additions. Anyone with a shred of opportunity to impress week one, add them to your roster if you have the room. There is zero value to having unoccupied roster space. There just isn't. To me, just put something there. Anything could happen. You never know. If whoever you do end up grabbing does nothing, and there's someone you want to add after week one who did impress, cut him. You didn't have to pay anything to get him. Call it a day, move on. And then lastly, consider some tier down options as well if you're lacking some depth on your bench, and you can turn one starting asset or starting bench asset that's on your bench into two slightly lesser assets that can still be factored into a starting lineup at some point. Guys you want to start, not just tearing down and adding a rookie pick, whatever the case is, because that is really a 1-for-1 deal. Make it 1-for-2, get two players that you could possibly throw in a lineup. Definitely something worth exploring. And also get your taxi spots in order too. If your league has a taxi, pay attention. If your league doesn't have a taxi, talk to your commissioner. But something with taxi spots, for me, if I'm a competitive roster, the taxi is for players that, who knows? They're for players that I cannot afford. I need flexibility on my bench. I cannot afford for wasteful rookie space or second-year player space who may or may not pan out. They go to the taxi squad to chill there. If I am a rebuilding team that wants a little more flexibility on my bench and I know I'm going to keep some players, those guys go to my taxi squad because I know I'm going to keep them, leave them there, leave my bench spot open so I can make waiver wire moves, etc. Go add the exciting week one players who happen to be on waivers. If your league is a 40-man league, 12-team league, you're not going to have much going on your waivers, but there's a lot of leagues that we do in our roster reviews, shameless plug, roster reviews in the pinned comment or the YouTube description box below. There's a lot of leagues out there that are 20-man leagues, 10-team league, or not 20-man leagues, but 20 roster spot leagues, 10-team leagues that have viable waiver space or waivers out there that, make it a little more exciting, whatever the case is. So take the time, look around, see what's out there. If you're competitive, get that taxi squad full of question marks. If you're not competitive, put the players on your taxi squad that you're going to keep that bench, viable, open, ready to add or cut players need be. Zach, I know this is, kind of one of those cliche points to a degree, but it all goes into the puzzle. Every little thing you do goes into winning a championship someday. Zach, what are your thoughts here?
The only thing I want to add to this is, we're at the point now, like you started off the show, we are a week away from football. and you're at the point where people are coming back to your leagues if they've been gone or dormant, and they're finally starting to address some small things that they need to do on the roster. So a good example I have here is, and this is not a situation where I needed to clear a roster spot, but it could apply in that situation. Another owner in our league needed a quarterback and realized it now. I think what happened was he had Drake May, and it was announced that Drake May was not the starting quarterback. So he reached out to the league and said, "Oh, I need a quarterback." And then he traded for Deshaun Watson. I rostered Jameis Winston. And so at that point, I reached out to this owner and I said, "Hey, I'll give you Jameis Winston, since you just bought Deshaun Watson, for a 2026 third-round pick." So these are those situations where you're just keeping track of what's happening in your league, who's making what move, and instead of getting that piece off your roster for some late fab, like I just picked up a third-round pick. Now, look, there's you can sit here and you could always look at the other side. A lot of times, everybody thinks the grass is greener on the other side. And of course, if Deshaun Watson misses time, Jameis Winston is a very interesting quarterback in fantasy football. I'm just not going to rely on that. Okay, like a lot of times the grass isn't always greener on the other side. So I'm going to take that. We just talked about this, with the Jacoby Brissett and Sam Darnold, getting that value while you can. Well, that was my opportunity to get value off of Jameis Winston, who doesn't have any value. And yes, I understand. Maybe Jameis Winston's value goes to a second if he becomes a starter. Sure. I'm not going to wait for that to happen, and neither should you. Like we are always waiting for the peak of everything to happen, and that's just not a realistic situation. If you can capitalize right now, just by monitoring the moves that other teams are making, did they suffer an injury and now you have the handcuff, or did they acquire someone and you have the handcuff? These are situations where you have to be keeping a pulse on your league and your league mates in order to take advantage of these moves. And as a matter of fact, Bob, the Jameis Winston move, that was 30 minutes ago. That was right before we started recording.
Sick.
So nice. It's just another example of keeping the pulse on your league, making sure that you're paying, even though you have nothing to do with it, just go and check that notification and see what it is, because the moment you can capitalize, you need to. Because in Dynasty, if you're not first, you're last. If you're not the first rebuilding team, you're out of luck because somebody else has 3 first-round picks and found the teams that were willing to give up the first-round picks. In this case, I found somebody who needed a quarterback and needed that security at the quarterback position, because clearly they had just traded a first-round pick for Deshaun Watson. I'm like, dude, give me any year third-round pick. I don't care. 26, 27, done deal. I got a 26 third-round pick for Jameis Winston. I'm happy.
The best part about that trade, Zach, is because of the fact that he needed him as Deshaun Watson's handcuff. You got him for a third-round pick, and the way I see it is a player's worth whatever the league can get for him. And even if Deshaun Watson gets hurt and Jameis Winston value goes up, that manager is not going to trade Jameis Winston because he needs him. So even if his value went up to a second-round pick, it's never going to be realized. So you probably just sold him at his max value anyway. And it's far more likely, in my opinion, that Jameis Winston's just a traveling salesman for the league at this point, not ever going to be a long-term starter again. Either way, Zach, I love that move. I love that concept that you brought up, and another lovely addition. Now let's talk about some moves to not make. We had to throw some of these in here because we've beat to death moves to make all offseason. And, honestly, we left the moves to not make a little by the wayside. And I think those are just as important. Like I mentioned at the top of the video, Zach, give me your first move to not make. I love this. You brought it up. It's just one of those things that I get it, but I don't love it. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's the concept of stacking players, right? And my move to not make is stop buying players just to have stacks. Like, stacks are cool, but I never in my life try to have a stack. If it happens, it happens. And I'm not saying like I don't go out there and try to acquire CJ Stroud, even though I have Nico Collins. Me trying to acquire CJ Stroud has nothing to do with me having Nico Collins. That's my point that I'm trying to say, is stop trying to make these moves just to have stacks. And I'll give you an example of what made me bring this point up in just a little bit. But I get asked a lot of times, Bob, for player price checks, when most of the time, if I'm being honest with myself and that other owner, which is something I will do, Bob, is I will say, hey, are you sure? Or really what I'm trying to say here, Bob, is it doesn't make sense for some of the other teams in certain situations to acquire these stacks. I'll give you a good example. Just this morning, I am in a one quarterback league. I roster CJ Stroud among my other quarterbacks, and somebody came to me. They just acquired Tank Dell, and they wanted to now inquire about CJ Stroud. And this was a rebuilding team. They just drafted Caleb Williams. Again, it's a one quarterback league. And he comes to me today, say, hey, man, what are you looking for CJ Stroud? And I'm like, well, it wouldn't be cheap. It'd probably be Caleb Williams plus. And I'm saying, like, this doesn't make sense for you. You're rebuilding. You just drafted a quarterback that, if he does what everybody thinks he does, he probably outproduces his ADP this year. Next year, he's probably maybe close to where CJ Stroud is being drafted in drafts right now. It just doesn't make sense, And it's like, well, I'm looking to get the stack. And I'm like, why? Like, why? You're not competitive this season. You're perfectly set at quarterback, at least for now. Like, let's ride that wave and see how Caleb Williams looks for you. Again, a team that they just drafted Marvin Harrison Jr. They just drafted Caleb Williams. One or two other pieces they drafted. They didn't win a game last year in the league. And I'm saying to myself, like, why are you wanting this stack? And so, to me, my move to make is stop trying to stack players just to have stacks. If it makes sense for your team, sure, and it's an organic stack, fine. Like the word I used in the show sheet is naturally. If you're like naturally able to get a stack, that's fine. But to go out of your way sometimes just to have it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And quite honest, me personally, Bob, unless it's a start 11, start 12, I don't like having multiple players from one team on my rosters just to minimize my risk of if they play a game and they lost 6-3. Now I got two players on a team that scored 3 points. It's probably not good for my fantasy team. So you can't avoid that, especially in deeper leagues where you're starting 11, start 12. You're probably going to have one or two players or one or two pairs of players on the same teams, and that's fine. But a lot of times I'm not looking for stacks. I'm not looking to acquire players from the same offense unless they're an elite offense. And yeah, I'm sure Houston could be considered that. But again, he had Caleb Williams. Didn't make sense for him to go out there and make this move. So stop trying to acquire players just to stack players. Build good rosters. Let those things work themselves out organically. I think sometimes dynasty owners are trying a little bit too much in certain situations to have stacks. And a lot of times it's an emotional thing. Oh, I'm a Houston Texans fan. I want to have these guys. That doesn't work for fantasy football. That typically doesn't work. You can't play an emotional game. It's another point we talk about all the time. But for me, I don't care about stacks, and I'm definitely not trying to go out there and acquire them.
Here's the 3 issues I have with stacks, and there's probably more. There's probably more ways to break this down. I just want the player that's going to score me more points. Having the stack, and this is point number 2, gives me no real value. Because if the stack is between Nico Collins, I have CJ Stroud, let's say, for just an example, since you brought him up. CJ Stroud is my quarterback. I have AJ Brown, but I could go get the stack with Nico Collins. And yes, I'm aware that AJ Brown much more valuable than Nico Collins. So I'd get a piece back with Nico Collins. I'd rather just have the player that's scoring more points in my lineup. Just give me that. Just cut it off at that. So if I would more likely pivot off of a stack. I'd be happy to pivot off of a stack to improve a player. So it just doesn't really add value to my lineup. It's one thing to do it in best ball. Best ball makes a little more sense, especially in tournaments, stuff like that. I can get a little more behind it in that. But in just general fantasy, you're setting lineups. I'm just not about it. And usually people pick up on that you're trying to form a stack. And what they do then is they try to make you overpay, or you're willing to overpay because you're setting up a stack because it looks pretty when Joe Burrow throws a touchdown to Jamar Chase. Meanwhile, I could just, instead of having Joe Burrow or having Patrick Mahomes and then pivoting down to Joe Burrow, I could just have more points coming from Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen, whatever, insert quarterback that scores more points than Joe Burrow name here. We just don't need to get cute. Just don't worry about it. Get the player that scores more points in your lineup. You'll be fine. Stack your lineup with points, not with players. And the last move to not make, Zack. And this one I was talking to you about before we started this recording, and we were talking about adding in this concept. I am just miffed with one of my league mates because every year I'm trying to make deals with this guy and it's the same conversation every year. Never knows which way he's going. Always trying to start the season off competitive. By the end of the year, I'm trying to send him pieces to help him compete when I was a rebuilding team. And then he's like, oh, I'm not really looking to compete. I'm just going to let my pick slide or whatever. And I'm like, okay, dude, whatever. Try to do the same thing this year and help him turn his, start a rebuild. And he's like, I'm going to, and every year ends up a mid-tier team doing nothing for no one in the league, nothing, especially not himself, most importantly. So my move to not make, don't let yourself fall into the middle. And if you do, get the frick out as soon as possible, because maybe you're making the playoffs, but you're exiting early. Maybe you're not making the playoffs and you're just having a mid to late first round pick, whatever the case, either way. If you're in the middle, your pick just loses a ton of value because you're not getting in the playoffs to have an opportunity to win money to win your league, or you're just having a later first round pick because you didn't make the playoffs. Congrats. You scored just enough points. You were just in the chase. And that's probably it is the worst place to be, plain and simple. So there's two ways to get the heck out of the middle. Get better. That's option number one, or get worse. Option number two. You can actually put those in whatever order you like. It doesn't really matter to me. But if you're trying to get better, you make moves to tier up where you can, but you have to keep in mind this takes depth and draft capital to accomplish, which if you've been trying to compete this whole time and really haven't made the right moves and you just haven't gotten any traction, you might not have a lot of liquid assets to move if you're not an active player that's trying to find ways to get plus assets onto your roster. That's why we talk so heavily about trying to get, when we're rebuilding, especially or building up to a competitive push, building up your asset pool so you can make these tier up deals in season, out of season, in drafts, whatever the case is. You need that. If you don't have that, you can't make the tier up moves where you need to really get, because if you're a mid-tier team, if you're stuck in the middle, it's probably because you're starting a lot of mid-tier players. You were too worried about setting up stacks, so you end up with a lot of mid players and it just doesn't work out, whatever the case is. So getting worse is usually the safest route. And I know it sounds counterintuitive, but when you remove assets from your roster and diversify your portfolio into young assets and draft picks, or just a bunch of draft picks, whatever the case is, however you want to play it. If you feel good about how you can assess players once they've hit the league, focusing on some young players, how they do in their early seasons, something I advise. But if you feel really good about how you draft and how you assess rookie prospects and picking up values in drafts, how you maneuver drafts, feel free to go with just a bunch of picks, either which way, getting more assets on your roster, kind of restarting things, selling players at their peak values in season. Ideally, you're selling them before you get points onto your roster to start the year. But if you don't do it, then selling by midseason when the arms race happens, when people are trying to make their big playoff pushes, that's when you can usually get a ton of value before trade deadlines, whatever the case is. But you do that, sell your players' peak values, improve your own rookie pick, and you improve your own rookie pick by scoring less points. Naturally easy to do. I get wanting to be competitive, but I talked about it before. Playing the hokey pokey is how you get yourself in trouble in Dynasty. Just compete or don't do this middle of the row nonsense. It's so frustrating to me to see managers do this to themselves in leagues I'm with, even though, hey, it's a benefit to me, but it's just like, I'm trying to help you out, man. I'm trying to help you be competitive last year to help my rebuild. I'm trying to help your rebuild this year by making myself more competitive. I just can't get on the same wavelength with some people. I get it. I get wanting to just try to start being competitive, but at some point you need to make the moves that fit the trajectory you want. Just like you want to get healthier, whatever the case is whatever you want to do in your life, you have to take the steps to get there. And if you don't do that, you're just going to end up mid, and that's the worst place you can be. Zach, feel free to touch on this one.
I think we all know somebody in our leagues that just doesn't know how to get out of their own way sometimes, and it can be a lot of other things. It can be it can not just be hanging on to players that they shouldn't hang. It's drafting players they shouldn't draft. Like I remember early on in the beginning part of rookie drafts, there was some people drafting Spencer Rattler in the second round. It's like, dude was a fifth round pick. Like I don't know why you would do that. So there are just a lot of things to try and it's hard to have that self-realization, right? It's hard to know yourself when you're doing these things. And look, I I don't. By the way, I don't want anybody to think like Bob and I are like perfect by any means. You know, I had a
Nope.
situation last year where I was in the first year of an orphan takeover. Somebody, I can't remember what the offer was. It was for Donta Foreman, and obviously I have no use for this player. And I was like, no, like this is a terrible offer. He's still on my roster right now, you know. And he like I wish I had taken whatever. It was probably like a 4th-round pick, and you know at that point I think he was like starting for the Bears. I was like, no, I'm not giving you a 4th-round pick. Somebody will give me a 3rd, and nobody did. Nobody did. And that goes to the Jameis Winston point that we just talked about a few minutes ago. Either, you know, you have to have and that's such a minimal example. I mean, really, you get mid by bigger things like that. You know, by not moving, you know, you should be moving Derrick Henry if you're a rebuilding team right now. You should be moving Raheem Mostert, James Conner, all those guys that have just a 1-year snapshot shelf life at the current moment. They could have another 1-year shelf life next year, but we can't predict that. You know, we're not fortune tellers. We don't have a crystal ball. No idea how that's going to work out. So the best way to do this is have somebody else look at your team. You know, we have the roster reviews. I have a few go-to people. You're one of them, Bob. When I'm stuck on a decision, I'm like, give me your neutral advice here. I have a few of those that I go to. And then, of course, we have our Discord, which we have so many different tabs, our trade discussion, and so on and so forth. But this is a hard one for people that don't see it themselves. Right? Like there are people watching this right now and be like, oh yeah, that's somebody else. Like it could be you. It could be you. Like you don't know. That's the thing. You don't know you're stuck in the middle. So that's an opportunity where you can get a roster review or jump into Discord, get the free trial, you know, just send people your team. Hey, what do you think? What should I do here? We'll check it out. You'll have me, Nate, Bob, Mike, Caleb, Hoff. There's a bunch of other people you don't see behind the scenes that do great work for us that can give you a lot of help as well. So it's not just the guys you see on the camera. There's a lot of people behind the camera that do a lot of great stuff too. So this is just, again, you might not see it, so have somebody else help you with it. And that takes gusto, you know, it takes a lot of self-reflection to say, I don't know what I don't know, you know? So good point, Bob. I wish it was mine. You stole it from me.
But, and not just us in that Discord, there's 200 plus people in the community that will rally behind you in your roster as well. But, you know, you touched on it. We are not perfect. You know, the reason I can talk about this is because I've made these mistakes and I just don't want you to make the same ones. Learn from my mistakes, what I've done in the past, holding on to players too long, drafting players way too early, whatever the case is. This is why we talk about this stuff, to try to help you guys out, not make the same mistakes we did. And that's one, you know, how I've gotten stuck in the middle in leagues too, is by, you know, wasting draft picks, drafting players too early, or not getting rid of players when I should, or the flip side of that, getting rid of players too soon, too early, whatever the case is, and giving up on players before they really reach their potential. But great additions as always, Zach. We are going to get the heck out of here, but we hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below your thoughts. What moves are you making? What moves are you not making? And head on over to patreon.com/NiceRewind. Get in that Discord server for a free 7-day trial. Drop your team in there. We'll all talk about it and see what we can do to get you out of the middle. If you're in the middle, maybe help you compete or help you rebuild. Whatever the case is, we got your back. With all that said, Zach, all the promo in the books, we're going to get the heck on out of here. We will see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.